Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's discussion hosted by the Freeman Air and Space Institute. My name is Rehana Noshirvani. I'm a research associate here at FASI. I'm delighted to be moderating this follow-up session, building on the insights and energy from our previous event in late February. Our first conversation on the role of air and space power in Ukraine's defense was rich and urgent, but as many of you will remember, we simply ran out of time to cover everything. Since then, the conflict has continued to evolve rapidly. Within hours of wrapping up that initial session, the surprise meeting between President Zelensky and President Donald Trump in Washington added a new and astonishing layer to our conversation. Developments since have only underscored the importance of this discussion. We are thrilled to welcome back our brilliant panelists. Dr. Marina Miron, postdoctoral researcher at the Department of War Studies. In the last session, she discussed Russia's space capabilities and their strategic implications. Dr. Daniel Salisbury, senior research fellow at the Center for Science and Security Studies. His latest paper for FASI, a follow-up on a previous one, which will be published in the coming months, examines how Russia's Air Force has adapted under sustained embargoes. And last but not least, Dr. Julia Moravska, our very own visiting senior research fellow here at FASI and senior associate fellow at the NATO Defense College, who discuss Ukraine's air and missile defense and the role of uncrewed aerial systems. To kick things off, I'll be posing some of the questions we didn't have time to get to in our last session. These have been consolidated to reflect overlapping themes and ensure we cover as much ground as possible without getting redundant. As always, we encourage you to contribute your own questions. Please add them in the chat throughout the session in the Q&A box in your Zoom. Without further ado, let's get started. This is a question, I guess, for all of you guys. I'll leave it up to you who wants to go first. But given how the capabilities of both adversaries and allies are shaped by dependencies, whether it's Russia adapting to sanctions for components or NATO's reliance on US missile defense, how should states manage the balance between operational readiness and the strategic risks that come with foreign reliance in critical defense technologies? Did you want me to, let me know if you want me to repeat that, but who'd like to go first? Yes, Marina.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll go first, just briefly outlining a little bit the strategic landscape, because what we have to understand here is the main drivers that has led to this dependency, namely globalization. And so we see this interconnectedness after the end of the Cold War that has been going so we've seen integration both horizontal and vertical in terms of dependencies, in terms of different industries relying on each other and relying on raw materials from third countries, with a specific vision of how the geopolitical landscape will develop. To quote Francis Fukuyama, this is the end of history and the victory of liberal democracy. And the problem is that there has not been a strategy laid out for a worst case scenario. What if things shift? And so fast forward to where we are today, and perhaps important to mention this in light of the new tariffs imposed by the Trump administration now on European countries, including also, I think 180 countries were on the list, but European countries were also on the list. Now, the problem is, how do you shift away from this globalized supply chain to a more local one? And we have an interesting example would be Japan. So what Japan did, essentially is the same thing that the United States is trying to do right now, but in a more gradual fashion, namely industrialize, keep the brains in the country, minimize dependency on imports in a general kind of manner. And I think what we are seeing now, and this should be a lesson learned, is that we will have to be, let's say, as speaking as NATO, without taking into account the United States now, we will need to strategize here in terms of how can we revive our European industries and how can we work together and reinforce the alliance, because you have certain collective threat perceptions which are not uniform by any means. And then you have economic imperatives. And these economic imperatives are at odds with each other. So unless you work together, for instance, the European Union said that they don't want EU and Turkey to be part of this list of, from which the EU would purchase from which the EU would purchase military equipment, for instance. While at the same time, both Turkey and the UK are in NATO. So you see, a lot of kind of political play is here. And I think this is the issue, the idea of, is everybody responsible for their own survival, or can we harmonize our interests in such a way that we can work in a coalition and also plan for a worst case scenario, because we will be left without capability, say, if the United States doesn't exit NATO, but just assumes a very passive role in NATO. What will happen? And of course, it requires a long-term strategic planning in terms of acquisition of raw materials. Where are these raw materials and who controls the market? China controls about more than 90% of raw materials and rare earths. Russia is exporting uranium, titanium to the United States. Ironically, those are the two products that are not sanctioned. So I think it's not just a matter of defense planning, it's also a matter of a long-term planning in terms of economic cooperation and creating viable relations with those states who can procure certain materials. Because for Europe specifically, we don't have any rare earths. We don't have really anything when it comes to those things. And we have to rely on other partners to provide those materials. We cannot live without these dependencies. So we should design our policies in such a way as not to spoil those relationships with those existing partners and try to kind of navigate this very difficult geopolitical landscape, bearing in mind that we have these dependencies. Thank you.
Oh, that's fascinating. Julia, did you want to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Ray. So I think, Marina, it has been really great that you kind of outlined the larger strategic context, because that will allow me to, bring it down and make it very narrow from my perspective, which is looking at air and missile defense capabilities regarding Ukraine in this particular case. I mean, later on, we can also discuss the NATO context and the European context in this field, because both of these fields, the war in Ukraine, but also NATO air and missile defense capabilities, really crystallize this question of dependencies, existing in alliances, building alliances, relying on alliances for capability generation, but also self-reliance, and in Ukraine's case, resilience, domestic resilience. So obviously, as is no secret to anybody, on this webinar, Ukraine has had to rely very heavily, very significantly on Western air defense capabilities, and this goes across all categories, all ranges, starting from point defense and man-pads, so, man-portable systems, all the way through short range, medium range, and long range. However, sometimes it's easy to forget that actually, for all of these categories, including point defense, Ukraine still relies to a significant extent on obsolescent Soviet era ground-based air defense systems that it had prior to the full-scale invasion. And I think what's really crystallizes this for me is, while it's operating some of the most cutting-edge capabilities such as the Patriot system, um, Ukraine still uses, or at least several months ago, used the TOAD S-125 short-range surface-to-air missile system that dates back to the 1960s, which it brought out of storage at the start of the full-scale invasion, and it's completely manually operated, and its interceptor missiles are from the 70s and the 80s. And, while you do have success stories with it, such as, one crew bringing down one S-125 battery, bringing down a Russian caliber cruise missile, as well as, 50 other missiles and UAVs of different types. This type of H system is incredibly labor intensive and, intellectually complex to operate, inefficient, and it requires constant maintenance and repair. And so why am I telling you this? It's just to illustrate that, like, it's not out of a kind of quirk that Ukraine does this, but it's out of necessity due to the reliance on partners for air defense capabilities and continued shortage and delays on the part of supplies by partners, for various reasons, which we have discussed in the previous session, and I think are fairly well known. And so, Ukraine continues to do its best in this regard, but at the same time, this kind of self-reliance has limits and trade-offs. I mean, it's not all about using obsolescent and aged equipment, as many of you who are focused on watching Ukraine in this area will know. There are a number of other strategies that Ukraine can use and has used and is using to kind of balance against critical reliances in the field of air and defense capabilities. So one obvious one is, of course, domestic production and domestic innovation. Just recently, Ukraine actually unveiled a maritime drone, or an unmanned surface vehicle called the Katran, which can travel over 1,000 kilometers and can be equipped with torpedoes and minigun, machine gun, and manpads, and can actually engage and bring down aerial targets as well. And that just that's kind of the other sort of end of the spectrum. And in between, you have all sorts of other innovations, including Ukraine working on short-range air defense systems, domestic short-range air defense systems, both and medium range as well, both kind of developed organically, so to speak, but also various types of integration of existing systems. I think one of the latest ones, I mean, we've all talked about the Frankensams, but one of the latest ones is actually using a Humvee with an R-73 air-to-air missile adapted for surface-to-air engagement. So all of this to say is that, figuring out how to manage unreliable alliances and critical dependencies is difficult in a stable environment, or even in a uncertain environment, but it's hellish in a state of war. And I think just reflecting on that as we watch what's happening in Ukraine is instructive for all of us.
That's a very good point. Before moving on to the next question, I wanted to highlight a comment by Professor Sir Christopher Colville. On Marina's point, the decision is largely political rather than industrial. Europe must ensure it harmonizes capabilities, which means especially establishing and maintaining research and development capabilities, robust supply chains, and enduring agreed shared dependencies. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, just briefly, I fully agree with that. It's very political, and businesses, European businesses, are dragging their well, they're dragging their feet in terms of increasing their capabilities, production capabilities, because they want long-term contracts. And the problem is that national governments don't want to sign them. And also our fiscal policies, and by our I mean European fiscal policies, are not designed to support defense industry. And so this is, on the one hand, this is a national political and economic decisions that have to be taken in every particular country. France being an example, where France is almost, you could say, self-sufficient in a sense, being an outlier amongst other European countries. And then you have countries like, say, Germany, um, which is dependent on supply, or on the global supply chain much more. And so I think it's both political, economic, and fiscal policies that need to be addressed on the national and supranational level, so international level, EU level speak. Thank you.
For Dan, I mean, I say this question's for you, but your colleagues are welcome to pitch in. You note that Russia has managed to nullify the worst effects of the embargo, though at the cost of more ambitious programs. What, in your view, constitutes success for an embargo? Containment of future capability, immediate disruption, or strategic delay? And how does the Russia case challenge or affirm that standard?
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having us back on to talk through these issues a little more. So yeah, just a kind of little quick summary of my paper that is hopefully imminently going to be published. So I talk a little bit about how Russian aerospace forces have responded to the embargo. I produce a little bit of a framework there, look at response strategies and tactics, and basically kind of argue that Russia has struggled. But as well as this being due to the effects of the embargo, this is also due to the sort of extreme wartime stresses and pressures and sort of operational tempo that it's had to maintain. And my main conclusion, I guess, is the worst impacts of the embargo are going to be felt on the sort of longer term, more advanced programs. The kind of next generation stuff that Russia's pursuing in terms of the Su-57 and Su-70 type projects. In terms of the effectiveness of embargoes, I'd say that really in no case have we ever seen a kind of 100% effectiveness or 100% success in cutting an economy or an air force or a military industrial complex off from the global economy. But I wouldn't say that this is the only objective. I think there are a lot of different objectives that we pursue embargoes for. And when I sort of think about this, I like to step back and think about also the tools that are used to implement embargoes, so export controls and that kind of thing. So at the strategic level, it is about constraining, making sure that states don't get hold of the technology. It is about trying to degrade capability over time, and it is about, I guess, ultimately deterring as well. The threat of embargo is maybe sometimes as powerful as the actual embargo once imposed. Um, Moving down from the strategic level, the kind of more procurement level, obviously it's about preventing technology getting through. It's about disrupting networks. It's about deterring industry from selling things to embargoed countries. And also, I think underpinning this as well, there's kind of an intelligence role. So if you're able to interdict shipments and kind of see what technology continues to flow once the embargo is in place, you really get a better sense of the dependencies and the industrial base there. I think in terms of the Russian case and how this fits in, my first FASI paper looked at a range of cases, from sort of Rhodesia, South Africa, through to the Cold War, COCOM embargo, and that kind of thing. I think the Russian case really confirms again that 100% success is not possible. It confirms the difficulty of getting a really good picture of what's happening on the ground there. And it confirms, I guess, as well that once we put in place an embargo, we're always going to get kind of networks and responses in place as well. And I kind of think of this a little bit as sort of Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that's what we're seeing with these networks. I think it also seems to confirm that the embargo had some effect in the Cold War as well. We're seeing still some of the same dependencies 30 years later. And in terms of the novelties of the case, I don't actually really see a huge amount of novelty in the embargo, or kind of reinforces these same sort of patterns over time.
In case there is a lifting of some of these in a scenario where there's a political settlement, do you think that we would see a rapid catch up in advanced system, or has the structural damage from the embargo created a sort of generational setback?
I mean, I think it really depends what is lifted. And I think we all know that the kind of policy situation here is a little bit chaotic and maybe a little bit schizophrenic at the moment. It's very difficult to read into what's really happening there. I think one of the things, and I talk a little bit about this in the new paper, civil aviation and the embargo on sort of airlines and spare parts. I'd be very surprised if there is a lifting of sanctions that this isn't included. I think it is always maybe a little bit more contentious because of the safety dimensions here, and also probably potentially profits for Boeing that maybe help to offset a shrinking European or other markets around the world. Dual use goods, I think microelectronics and machine tools are really things that Russia's in need of and has been pursuing. They've been managing to get, I guess, kind of a flow of these, but sort of via these kind of quite unreliable and probably messy procurement networks. I think there may be some reluctance potentially amongst industry to re-enter the Russian market here as well. With sanctions and embargoes, it's not something that you can just switch on and switch off, right? And I guess a lot of this as well might depend on the willingness of banks and that kind of thing to get back into the market as well. In terms of what the effect of this will be, is it a generational setback or not? I think we need to think not just about the losses of aircraft in the conflict, but also this idea of imputed losses that I saw in the Rand Corporation report, whereby just a higher operational tempo and sort of attrition is going to mean that a lot of the airframes that are in service are going to go kind of out of service or quicker. And they were talking about, the equivalent of 60 airframes or 26 new airframes equivalent that were being kind of lost a year through this, as well as the battlefield losses as such. And so the ability to kind of reconstitute that is going to take some time. But then I think it's really the ability to compete on these kind of next generation projects that may be longer for a time frame. So I mean, it really depends on what kind of sanctions are lifted and how, but I see if the embargo is lifted, it may well take, or probably will take years for the Russian aerospace force and defense industry to kind of get back to where it would want to be.
That's very interesting. Julia, here's a question for you. Given that the US remains the only NATO member with a fully integrated upper tier ballistic missile defense architecture, what are the implications of Washington's growing strategic shift toward the Indo-Pacific for Europe's long-term missile defense resilience? And should European capitals be planning for greater independence as a result?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Good question. So I'll enter it in the NATO context because I think that just really, encapsulates all of the how can I put this, coming doom in a nice and neat way, and the extreme volatility of the current situation. So As some of you may know, NATO has two what is called standing activities regarding integrated air and missile defense. One is in peacetime. One is air policing, and the other one is the NATO ballistic missile defense, or BMD for short. And actually, NATO members rely to a great extent on U.S. capabilities for upper tier ballistic missile defense in particular. So this is needed to, defend against long-range ballistic missiles outside of Earth's atmosphere. And the U.S. provides this contribution through something called the EPA, or it's the European Phased Adaptive Approach. And that's Obama era kind of vehicle, but essentially it's a way to organize, arrange, station, service, maintain the Aegis ballistic missile defense system at different European or geographic European bases and sites to essentially provide coverage to Europe. And there are a number of, and as I briefly go through this, I think it will become clear why this is such precarious and a very difficult, risky moment for European ballistic missile defense in particular. So the Aegis system consists mostly of U.S. capabilities. So, for example, Spain currently is hosting 4 BMD-capable Aegis ships at the naval base in Rota in Spain. But again, those are U.S. capabilities. There's something called Aegis Ashore, which is a land-based ballistic missile defense site in Romania. There is recently, relatively recently, in July 2024, so July of last year, the Aegis Ashore site in Poland was completed. It was delayed by 5 years and was meant to be completed by the end of 2023, but it was only operational in the middle of 2024. There is a radar in Turkey, and there's command and control and battle management and communication in Germany, in Ramstein. So all of these things that I have just listed are U.S. capabilities. And also, U.S. currently is the only NATO member with ballistic missile early warning radar systems and early warning satellite for missile threat identification. But I should say that one of the early warning sites is actually serviced by Royal Air Force personnel and is located here at the RAF Langdale space, but the radar itself is maintained by the U.S. So you can see from everything that I have just said that this is a case that I think in many ways is unpalatable for the current U.S. administration, because it is U.S. capabilities stationed outside of U.S. in Europe, primarily for the defense of Europe, requiring a considerable amount of U.S. funding for maintenance, for servicing, for the personnel. Although of course, other countries host and contribute as well. And so that, for me, even though it's so critical and has been a bedrock of transatlantic integrated air and missile defense, is very worrying, just because of the way that this kind of capability is maintained and provided, i.e., relying for continued maintenance and funding, and kind of operational readiness on the U.S., but primarily for the defense of Europe. So I think that yes, absolutely. This has been flagged in the past, the vulnerability in terms of US reliance and the shift to Interpac, or whatever you kind of want to call it, or just a simple kind of distaste for, as some high level officials have said, bailing out Europe. Um, but I think the kind of current constellation of factors has really brought it to a focus. So yes, absolutely. I think Europe needs to start thinking about what it means if the US were to deprioritize significantly its contribution to European air missile defense. Ray, you're on mute.
Sorry. Marina, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just briefly to add to an excellent point made by Julia, is also the data that is needed for these kinds of things to operate an integrated air defense. And specifically speaking, since we were touching on air and space, the space capabilities and the development R&D in terms of military space capabilities is lacking in Europe. I mean, mostly the Europeans are looking at dual use, say Copernicus or Galileo. Yes, there are military applications. They are very limited and they are not mentioned, but it seems like there is not enough focus. And UK is in a very precarious position since Brexit, because they are not now they cannot get, the UK armed forces cannot get the data from European Galileo satellites. So it's kind of, you have the separation, which kind of goes into the question about the US being able to influence the operational deployment of the US allies military forces. And in a sense, yes, US has a monopoly when it comes to military satellites, followed by China. And so, yes, it's all about data. And we see in Ukraine, just, turning off access to that data uh, affects operational tempo, affects kill chain. Essentially, that's a critical component of that. So I think it is important to think about air defenses from the perspective of, yes, having physical and military equipment, but also from the perspective, what data can we feed? Do we have the radars? Do we have the satellites in order to be able to intercept incoming ballistic missiles? Because we've seen the Russians are innovating, so they have already made a step with the Oreshnik. What is our response? And they have essentially shown us that even despite the air defenses that we currently have, even if they're US operated as a part of the transatlantic cooperation, they might not be able to cope with these new hypersonic missiles. So I think it's a critical area that Europeans, together with the UK, perhaps need to think about in terms of intelligence or development of C4ISR, to state it briefly. Thank you.
Actually, on that note, there's a question here that I quite like, so I'm just gonna plug it in. It's out of order, so I apologize. I also apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. We have a comment for you, Julia, by Mike Harwood. Do you think, I think it's a very sharp observation. Do you think the Israelis proved that there's more to missile defense than defensive systems, i.e., the capability to attack those systems before they're launched?
Yes,
That was a really good question. Yes, yes.
100%. But also, obviously, there's the Israeli case, but there's also, if you think about the Ukrainian case, I think not only do you need a layered air defense system, right? Like you need your short range, you need medium range, you need, what's really critical is kind of, Marina was sort of alluding to, is the command and control and kind of the battle management aspect of it. But you also need to have offensive capability, whether it's aircraft, such as in Ukraine's case, which still or long range strike, which actually remain one of the, even though there's been some interesting innovation that we discussed, but it remains currently the most effective way of defending against Cubs. So the 1.5 to 3 ton aerial, the guided aerial bombs that Russia has been dropping. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have the capacity or the capability to do it. But yes, good point.
I would like to second that. This is a question for the panel. A lot of the next generation air dominance programs were announced and started development before the start of the war in Ukraine, with the recently revealed F-47 being an example of the big geopolitical actors beginning to test these systems. Sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses. Will there have been time for these countries to implement the lessons from the conflict, or do we expect these designs to already be fixed, possibly leaving these new systems to some of the same vulnerabilities experienced in Ukraine? Please let me know if you need me to repeat that.
I can
Julia?
have a stab. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this actually quite a lot because nobody has probably escaped rhetoric regarding needing to learn lessons from Ukraine. And what I have found is that those lessons are usually used to kind of, either prove or disprove whatever the person making that argument was already thinking anyway. But my point here is, I guess the short and direct answer is no. And the only conclusion that I can take away from that is that the kind of people in charge of foresight, requirement formulation, planning, do not believe that the next war or the war of the future, where this kind of capability, this kind of system will be required, will be sufficiently akin to what we're seeing in Ukraine. So they think they will be fighting a fundamentally different war, whether it's because they cannot fathom that they would not be able to establish air supremacy right away, or suppress enemy air defenses, would be able to suppress enemy air defenses. I'm not exactly sure, but just the more that I engage on this subject, the more I kind of realize that sort of requirement formulation in defense has been so far largely untouched by what is happening in Ukraine, for these kinds of large scale systems. Yeah.
A question by, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but Ludo Beverage. In March 2025, the US intelligence freeze severely limited the effectiveness of digitally reliant military systems such as HIMARS, MLRS, and Patriot batteries by cutting off their vital real-time targeting data. How does this alter the dependency dynamics inherent in arms transfers? And will this shift enable the US to influence the operational deployment of its allies' military forces in the future? Marina, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. This is the question that I was alluding to in my previous answer. Just a brief comment to Julia, which made some excellent points. And the defense industry, it has a specific inertia. It's not going to be able to react as fast. And a similar kind of issue I've heard about the production of drones, specifically FPV drones. NATO needs FPV drones because in Ukraine they have shown to be very effective. But the problem is you see this adaptation in Ukraine by the Ukrainian side. Ukraine invents something, the Russians invent countermeasures, mostly electronic warfare systems that get adjusted to the drones. And I think the technology changes so quickly that by the time you produce those drones, say for NATO, they might be their effects might have been already nullified. Besides, we don't know how the next war will look like. So that is something I wanted to add to Julia, and to answer the question regarding intelligence. I mean, if you look at military theory, even the Russian theory, information is key. You have to control information environment and have information superiority and deny information to your adversary. And this is what I was talking about when I said that the EU, specifically, and the UK also are lacking these capabilities, these intelligence gathering capabilities in form of space assets. Specifically, when we're talking about low Earth orbit, the US is now focusing, for instance, on exploiting the proliferated LEO for military purposes, for C4, and also for to enhance their ISR. So that the idea is to create a multi-layered system without relying on one specific orbit. Given the fact that the launches, the cost of the launches has been reduced now, also thanks to Elon Musk, in part, and so they have now a system that creates an integrated surveillance, if you will, using LEO, medium Earth orbit, and geostationary orbit. The EU doesn't have that, and having that superior information in real time, high resolution imagery, being able to pass it on, makes a huge difference. If your adversary is deaf and blind, and we've seen with the Russians struggling because their space capabilities are very much inferior and have been declining since the fall of the Soviet Union, and so they had to rely on the Liana constellation, their naval navigation system. And so if you have that superiority, of course, you can control, or you have the control. It's one more kind of tool that the US can use to control allies and to influence military operations, not to mention the fact that the US does most of operational planning on NATO level. Thank you.
So a question from our research fellow, Dr. Sophie Antrobus. If there is a negotiated ceasefire of some sorts, would you expect the Ukrainian Air Force to provide the majority of the capability for that, or will they need others to take the lead to give them time to recoup? How do you see Russia probing any air policing arrangements?
I mean, I can have a stab at the first part of that. It's been a while since I kind of looked at the capabilities of the Ukrainian Air Force, but I think this will actually, there's like a military answer to this and a political answer to this. And I think really Ukraine's Air Force is not, I think would struggle to enforce a ceasefire, or whatever we call it, if we call it a no-fly zone, alone. I mean, it hasn't been able to, and I don't see Russia kind of self-restraining in any way. So I think the kind of military necessity requirement answer to Sophie's question is yes. I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily characterize it as taking the lead in terms of, operational planning, but certainly kind of intelligence sharing and intelligence support, and support on kind of sorties and operations. Yes. But I think the fact that we are still, we still go back and forth regarding the type of assistance that Europe or whatever constellation of coalition of the willing will provide, what that tells me is that there are political barriers to this, which, are the result, I guess, is the same, right? That it's it is needed. But I think there are political obstacles to it being implemented. I don't really, to be honest, I don't know if anyone else can answer the question about Russia probing. I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, they love false flag operations. I don't know what that, we could think jointly maybe what that would look like in the air domain.
If I wanted to switch gears for a second, Daniel, this is a question for you. You suggest in your paper that Iran and North Korea now play critical roles in offsetting Russia's capability gaps. I kind of feel bad because I feel like that's a bit of a spoiler for your paper. But to what extent do you think these relationships are opportunistic versus structural? And could they evolve into long-term strategic dependencies that reshape the global military-industrial landscape beyond this conflict?
Yeah, thanks. I think so. These states' involvement is really interesting. Um, I'm not sure that they really play sort of a really critical role, but I think in the paper I more make the case that it's just kind of an interesting way that the embargo has I mean one of the factors that has kind of pushed in this direction, and they of course are also embargoed states themselves, and have air forces under embargo and are kind of trying to find various ways around that as well. So just as a bit of a recap, so Iran, I guess, has provided mostly drones, and I guess what most of the attention has been the loitering munitions, so the Shahed 136, which are the sort of quite slow propeller powered things that have been used to hit mostly civilian targets in Ukraine. I think these have been very cheap. The design, at least, or the concept, has been quite well received. And it's something that Russia now has taken and is manufacturing itself as the Jeren 2 in factories in Russia. We've also seen rumors that they would transfer ballistic missiles, but this is we haven't really seen yet. On the North Korean side, again, I think the main impacts here have kind of been broader than in terms of the long range strike. So we've seen the troops deployed. We've seen apparent reports apparently of North Korea providing upwards of 50% of Russian battlefield ammunition, which I'm not sure whether I believe or not. We've seen vehicles and artillery transferred. And I guess this is probably more important or more impactful than the long range strike capability. So we've seen ballistic missiles, short range ones, maybe 50, maybe 100, different reports there as well, transferred. And also a potential discussion of kind of drone collaboration. And I kind of think that they may have been watching the Russia Iranian partnership here, and also probably want to get involved in collaboration because they want to learn from Russia here as well. So I don't necessarily feel that this is going to change the global defense landscape as such. But obviously it's an interesting development. North Korea has had a kind of an active arms export industry for a long time. It's been a kind of a good source of revenue for the country, and the sanctions era has kind of curbed that a little bit. But I think this is really kind of a bonanza for them. And Iran, obviously is very active in exporting missiles around the Middle East. It's interesting that they haven't got involved in the missile trade here, like North Korea with Russia. So really, I think the longer term here depends a bit on the U.S.-Russia dynamic, and I think it's totally feasible that the US could potentially condition that in any kind of future agreement with Russia over the war in Ukraine or otherwise, that Russia cuts off these ties or curbs these ties in some way. Definitely with regard to Iran, which the current administration really, has a lot of beef with. North Korea, I think, is less of a less of a clear answer. Obviously, Trump got a little kind of humiliated by the unsuccessful kind of effort to curb the nuclear program back in his last administration, despite his romance with Kim. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And I guess, in Moscow, there are clearly some interest in these relationships. They've invested some political capital, but also I think a kind of a kind of a new kind of detente with the US, and the kind of benefits that would bring would probably be far more useful for Moscow than these kinds of relationships that have sort of contributed a little bit to the war effort.
I don't know if I misheard you, so correct me if I have. But actually, Iran has been supplying Russia with ballistic missiles. It was, I think this was found out back in autumn, and they got some new sanctions from Europe.
I'm not sure I've seen the kind of confirmed transfers, and I think one thing that we definitely haven't seen is wreckage of Iranian missiles used in Ukraine.
Interesting.
Like the North Korean wreckage has been, heavily studied, and because people are interested in what's inside North Korea's missiles in the same way that they're interested in what's inside Russia's military equipment, and the answer it tends to be is actually a lot of Western semiconductors in the same way, even the same companies and the same brands. I haven't seen evidence of Iranian wreckage yet. A lot of
That's
evidence of
interesting.
drone wreckage. And what's been interesting from that is that the earlier models were really, really basic, held together with hot glue, almost like a kind of arts and crafts project or something. Whereas the Russian kind of Duran 2 that they've developed has got a lot of kind of higher end materials, and although they've taken the Iranian design, they've really kind of revamped it and added a lot to it.
That's so sweet.
Isn't it just? Yeah. What a model of successful industrial cooperation. Iran brings the IP and, the
And the
licensing.
hot and the hot
Yeah.
glue.
Oh
Yeah.
God,
And Russia brings the
that gives me some good
destructive and
activity ideas. Anyway, sorry,
The
getting
latest
off course.
iteration has AI. So the latest iteration of Geraint2 or Shahid has AI now. So it's been evolving. I think it's like the fourth generation or
Hmm.
something that they're using right
yeah.
now.
There's
Yeah,
actually a guy on YouTube has like got hold of some of the electronics elements and has been kind of doing weird stuff like kind of plugging them into his computer and seeing what they do, and so it's really kind of bizarre to see parts of these drones for sale on eBay, and I guess so many of them have been fired at
oh my
Ukraine that
God.
they're kind of everywhere.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I need to stop laughing. This is not actually funny. Very serious. Another follow-up question by Jeffrey Wardle. In the unlikely event of a ceasefire in the Ukraine war, how would Europe police a no-fly zone? Would we operate within Ukraine? I don't
um,
know. Julie, you
well,
want to take a stab at
I
that?
mean, just a quick aspect of it that wasn't highlighted before. So yeah, just to preface that I'm not like air kind of force design or a air power person, but I think for it to be the whole point of a no-fly zone is that it is enforced by um, external actors who have the capability to retaliate and neutralize targets, right? So if you do not venture into Ukrainian airspace, I mean, we have that already. We have the AWACS, the early warning aircraft that NATO operates that actually are able to see very deep into Ukrainian territory from the airspace of various neighboring countries such as Romania. or Poland. So very little of what happens in Ukraine in terms of air power, airspace, infiltration or engagement is not known to NATO forces. So they're watching it very literally as we speak. So and again, it's a political and no-fly zone is inherently a political instrument that signals the commitment of allies to the defense of another country's airspace. And the way that you signal that is that you put your aircraft into that country's airspace, and then and that signals that you are ready to not only monitor and observe the threats, but you are ready to engage and neutralize them.
In the interest of time, it seems that there's quite a number of questions that are coming in, so I'm just going to kind of go quickly through them. I hope you guys don't mind. The next question is by Jeffrey Allen. What do the panelists think of creating a rearmament bank or perhaps a defense security and resilience bank to support European and allied defense investment? How might financial institutions of this kind facilitate the pooling of procurement?
I can go briefly.
Yes, please.
Well, I think we have to think about who is going to invest. So we need investors. We need favorable terms for investors. So creating a bank, great. We have the European Central Bank already. Why cannot we use already existing structures and modify them to accommodate the changing circumstances when it comes to loans and to investments? And the other question is, you still have to invest into defense. Creating a bank is great, but you have to get countries to commit to defense spending. And that will be essentially a political question and a question of political will, as well as the economic imperatives. Now, for instance, I see in Germany, several politicians have been talking about, when we reach a ceasefire in Ukraine or some sort of peace plan, we will start importing Russian gas again, because you cannot afford. The one thing is to have your European industry and to invest money into it, but the other question is, what is the cost of, say, one artillery shell? Used to be about 2,000 euro in 2022, now it's 8, right? So if you allocate a specific amount of money, even if you say, okay, I'll invest 5% of my GDP into defense, if the prices have risen to such an extent, that will give you less of a capability. And another critical factor is time. How long do you have to wait for that capability? So I think, I wouldn't necessarily create a specific bank. I would try to alter the current fiscal regulations in order to make it more favorable for investors and for defense industry when it comes to loans, when it comes to investments. And of course, nobody can work on the political level, meaning that there will be countries which will be dragging their feet. Most likely those countries located in the south of Europe geographically, who do have a very different threat perception. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question. I'm sorry, we didn't seem to, we didn't seem to get to everyone. But here, the question is by Dejo Viner. Can someone speak to recent evolution of FPV drones in Ukraine such that, quote, 70% of casualties are due to drones? Speak to how fiber optic cables change the relevant tactics. Yes, Marina?
I feel like it's a Marina question. And
I'm sorry, it's me again. So
I would love to hear you actually talk on this. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing, it was a Russian invention, and I know that those drones have been used in the Kursk Oblast when the Russian forces were counterattacking. And the reason for these fiber optic drones are you cannot jam them, so you cannot use electronic warfare. And I alluded earlier to the fact that both sides are kind of playing this cat and mouse game, drone and counter drone systems. essentially, jamming the signal. The Russians would operate or change the frequencies in which they operate. The Ukrainians would adjust their EW systems and the other way around. And so with this drone, it has it's like that vacuum cleaner where you can pull out the cord. So essentially, it has this cord, and because it has a score, there are so many limitations that it was even laughed upon in Russian military blogs. Like, what do you want with this drone on a leash, right? Because it has a limited range. Because it depends on the length of the fiber optics cable. It can get caught up in trees because the cable itself rolls out. It weighs. There is a specific weight, and you have to think of how much such an airframe can support. So there were all these negative things. You can use less of an explosive charge because you already have that weight occupied by the cable, but it has been so effective that Ukrainians started building actually like corridors, like networks to catch the drones. And then they decided also to copy because it was effective, since there is no countermeasure, despite all the limitations that I just named. And this prompted another kind of round of innovations. Okay, it's not really new, but it's something that it's being worked on specifically by the Russians. Yeah, how do we counter these drones? Let's use laser weapons. So you can physically shoot them down, but now they're saying, well, it's already past electronic warfare. It has a cable, so we have to think of, either you have a kind of physical solution in like a metal cage or a net or whatever, or you shoot it down, or you basically evolve in terms of where is the operator of the drone sitting. Let's target the drone side. So there are like different levels to counter them, and it looks like the use of these drones has expanded the thinking. It was already there to a certain degree. Let's counter the site where the drone operators sit, not the drone itself, because it's much more effective. Or let's strike the drone producing facility. And I think this has put more emphasis on let's destroy the actually the center of gravity rather than the drone itself, plus this component of developing laser weapons in order to counter these drones. I hope that helps.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Marina. I have a question for Daniel. This last question, and then we can wrap up if that's okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time again. This is a really good chat, by the way. But anyway, for Daniel, this is by Professor Sir Christopher Colville. The key to achieving a degree of independence from the USA is for Europe to develop robust C4ISR and IND capabilities. These should be the priority for investment. Therefore, should we not accept that we should cease reliance on such systems as F-35 and refocus on European capabilities, Typhoon and Rafale, accepting their limitations. Sorry, my eyes can't see. Accepting their limitations, but acknowledging their benefits to independence and advantages to European aerospace industries. I need to put my glasses next time.
I mean, that's a huge question, and it feels a little bit outside of my expertise.
It was directed at you specifically.
Oh wow, okay. I think maybe one way of thinking about this is through the lens of embargoes, right? Is if the US and Europe are kind of going separate ways, and obviously Europe needs to focus on Russia as the existential threat and kind of less on sort of a pivot to Asia. Then the shape of the Russian aerospace forces and the embargo's impact on that, alongside other factors, is, I guess, going to probably shape the extent to which the Europeans need to be able to compete with what the Russians can offer. And if the embargo is affecting these kind of higher end next generation systems, then maybe it would enable a bit more flexibility on the levels of capability in Europe. But I am really going out on a limb here. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this.
I mean, I feel like we're 5 minutes past the end and we still have people on this call, so that's great. I mean, look, like at the like it's important to not swing into the other direction now, right? And kind of think, okay, let's just develop our our own indigenous kind of next generation aircraft or other kind of complex systems, because there's always a rationale for procuring these, right? Whether it's from the US, or usually from the US. And it makes a lot of sense economically, it makes a lot of sense in terms of upfront investment, but I think what I hope all European capitals are thinking about is that even if the current desire to completely disengage from European security is fleeting, and will be limited to this administration, can and should we really responsibly be counting on the kind of the other aspect that comes with these purchases from a country like the US, which is the security guarantees or the commitment of a US kind of US resources to the maintenance of these capabilities. Is it really responsible statecraft, or just being a domestic politician to hope that subsequent administrations will not exhibit the same level of not only the desire to disengage, but as we saw from Signalgate, the kind of almost ideological animosity. Unfortunately, it's extremely expensive to develop complex capabilities, extremely, and the deficits across European countries are already extremely. Most European countries are extremely high. We're already seeing some of these really painful cuts, such as kind of benefits in this country, social benefits, or foreign aid, and that will only exacerbated. But then you have to ask the question, is it better to be poor or be alive? Somebody put it to me that way. So,
Sorry.
On that note,
Marina,
I'm out.
Marina, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. Not to put you on the spot.
No. Just briefly to add to the whole discussion, and I think there was a question in the chat regarding the kind of the technological advancements and so on. And I just wanted to point out that yes, technology is important, but if you look at the history of warfare, it hasn't been the determining factor to success. In other words, if you look at so-called asymmetric wars, where you have a weaker side, usually a violent non-state actor, fighting an organized state armed forces, in most cases, statistically speaking, the state armed forces lose, despite the fact that they have all the technological capabilities. So we shouldn't really fall into the trap and feel kind of obliged to reinvent the wheel. Rather, I think a lot depends on the adaptability and on basically on being able to implement the lessons learned. Yes, technology is important. It can give you a strategic edge, but it's not the only determining factor in winning wars. And I think on that note, I'll leave it at that.
I feel like I'm opening a can of worms saying this. I completely agree with with what you just said, Marina, but there's also, I wanted to add that the definition of success, the reason sometimes that in counterinsurgencies, maybe you might feel like you're not winning or succeeding is, well, how are you defining your success? Because, in the case of Islamic Republic, they're always winning. So It's really hard to gauge.
Well, it's hard. Well, success, it depends on the outlined political goal. I'll be very Clausewitzian here and say politics rules, war is just an instrument. And if you have a specific outlined political goal and fail to achieve it, that means lack of success. So I'd say that the
Yes.
only kind of metric to use in terms of measuring. But if, as I said, with insurgents or whatever you want to call them, you go back, those guys in flip-flops, and that they have the time, they have the political will. I mean, look at Afghanistan, to name an example, not totally at random.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I feel like we barely scratched the surface. I'm going to take this as a very positive thing, and hopefully it means that y'all are interested in what FASI is putting out there, and we are happy to provide you with more. On that note, if there are specific topics that you would like for us to be publishing or having events on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We are very responsive. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and a huge, huge thank you to our panelists for joining us again to come and share your insights and expertise, and your time. We hope you found today's conversation as engaging and thought-provoking as the last one. If you'd like to stay informed about future events and research from FASI, or as I said before, give us more feedback, please do sign up for our mailing list and keep an eye out for upcoming announcements. Until next time, take care. Thank you again for being part of this conversation, and I hope you get to enjoy this beautiful weather we're having this weekend. So have a great, fantastic weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.